thing you got to do when you are writing a story is figure out what kind of story you want to write, like adventure story, romance, western, whatever. But for me, I always ask myself, will this make a good movie? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not worth telling. I mean, sure, all my books are based on true stories, but that doesn't mean they're true to life. In fact, I try to pick stories that are as cinematic as possible, which means I look for stories with lots of action, lots of stakes, lots of characters, ideally some humor, some heart, the whole 9 yards. This particular story checks every box on my list. It has more plot twists than a pretzel factory. There's enough action. To satisfy any Michael Bay wannabe, the stakes are off the charts. It has characters that leap off the page. It'll break your heart and it'll make you laugh until milk comes out of your nose. And the reason I say that is because this story is about baseball. So here we go. On May 8, 1974, the California Angels played host to the Milwaukee Brewers in Anaheim Stadium. Now, if you weren't alive in the 70s or if you were born after 1980, you may not know this, but back then the California Angels were actually called the California Angels. They would change their name to the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim in 1997 and then just the Los Angeles Angels in 2005, although from where I sit it should have been called the Taco Bell Angels since half the stadium was given over to what was at the time the largest Taco Bell cantina in the world. Anyway, the Angels were pretty bad back in 1974. They finished the season with a record of 69 and 93, but that wasn't nearly as bad as the Brew Crew from Milwaukee. They finished the year with a record of 59 and 103, which meant the Angels were actually 4 games ahead of them in the standings. So it wasn't exactly the World Series, but it was a beautiful Southern California evening, and the Angels were coming off a doubleheader split against the A's, meaning both teams were well rested. And so both managers decided to start their aces, Milwaukee's Moose Haas and the Angels' Nolan Ryan. Now, I'm sure most of you know who Nolan Ryan is, right? He pitched for the Mets, the Astros, the Angels, and the Rangers. He won 324 games, lost 316. He struck out 5,714 batters. He also pitched 7 no-hitters. But by 1974, he was already 31 years old, and he was pitching for the lowly Angels. Plus, he had a sore arm, so he wasn't really on top of his game. As for Moose Haas, well, most people don't remember him because he only pitched 12 major league games over parts of 3 seasons. He was, however, the first player ever signed by the Seattle Pilots when they joined the American League in 1969. And in 1973, he led the Brewers in wins with 16, which is why Milwaukee's manager, a guy named Bob Heiss, gave him the ball to start this game against the Angels. So the game started off pretty boring. Neither team scored in the first inning. Then in the bottom of the second, the Angels' Rod Carew singled, stole second, went to third on a single by a guy named Joe Askew, and then came home on a sacrifice fly by a guy named Don Baylor. So going into the third, the Angels were up 1-0. Then in the top of the third, the Brewers tied it when a guy named Gorman Thomas doubled, went to third on a single by a guy named Dave May, and then came home on a sacrifice fly by a guy named Don Money. Then in the bottom of the fourth, the Angels took the lead again on an RB single by a guy named Bobby Grich. But once again, the Brewers answered back in the top of the fifth. This time it was on an RB single by a guy named Oscar Gamble. And suddenly the game was tied at 2 apiece going into the bottom of the sixth. That's when things got weird. With 1 out, Angels catcher Jim Preach hit a pop fly that Brewers second baseman Jim kept close, raced back and made a spectacular catch. Except when he did, he collided with Brewers center fielder Oscar Gamble, and they both fell to the ground, and the ball popped out of capped Closey's glove and rolled away. As Jim Preach rounded the bases and trotted home, it became obvious there was no play at home plate, so instead of throwing the ball back to the infield, Gamble picked it up and chucked it toward second base in an attempt to get Preach, except he underthrew the bag and the ball rolled all the way into center field. And before anyone could figure out what was happening, Preach was halfway around the bases for what was now a 4-2 Angels lead. If you've seen my other videos, you know I'm a stickler for accuracy. And in that case, you'd think I'd stop the action, rewind, and correct the record. Except I can't because no one in the stadium knew what was happening. Players and coaches were standing around with their mouths open. Fans were stunned silent, and even the television broadcasters seemed confused. After Preach came around to score, the Brewers finally got the ball back and they stopped the bleeding when Haas forced Baylor at second to end the inning. But then the seventh started off with another single by Rod Carew. This time he beat out an infield single on a slow roller up the middle. He stole second base, went to third on A single by Joe Askew and then came home on a single by Bobby Grich. Suddenly it was 5-2 and the Angels were threatening to blow the game open. Haas managed to get the next two batters out, but not before Grich stole second. Then with 2 outs and runners on first and second, Nolan Ryan stepped up to bat. Now, if you're not familiar with baseball, you might be thinking, okay, so what? Ryan's batting. It's the 8th inning. They're already up 5-2. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that Moose Haas was not only pitching for the Brewers, he was also facing his former team, the California Angels. And you know what happens to be the personal business of Moose Haas. He absolutely hated the California Angels. In fact, during spring training in 1970, he got into a fight with Angels outfielder Ken Berry, and then he pissed management off by publicly criticizing their new stadium, which was scheduled to open that season. But due to legal issues, they ended up playing their first 3 home games in Los Angeles at Dodger Stadium. Anyway, Haas hated the team so much that when he left the Angels organization in 1972, he asked to be traded to any team in the National League so he'd never have to play against them again. But they refused and traded him to the Brewers, so now here he was, pitching against his old team, trying to keep them in the game. And let me tell you, he was absolutely fired up. As soon as he got behind in the count, he started throwing his fastball right by Ryan's head. Ryan obviously wasn't having it, so he started arguing with Haas, who responded by plunking him squarely in the shoulder. And as Ryan came around first base, he continued jawing at Haas, who kept staring him down until he reached second. That's when the benches cleared and Ryan ran toward the mound, arms flailing. Haas ran away. Everyone started fighting, and somehow Ryan ended up taking the plate. Ryan ended up finishing the inning on the mound, though. He allowed 2 more runs to score. And heading into the 9th, the Angels were leading 7-2. But now the Brewers had a new lease on life. They came into the 9th with the tying run on deck. Unfortunately, they didn't tie it. They actually won it when the next batter hit a grand slam. You want to know who hit the grand slam? Sure you do. It was Jim Capped Close. And if you want to know what happened next, well, you're just gonna have to watch my next video. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you next time.